Okay. Bez Hashem, today's daf is daf Chof Hey. I'm going to make it bigger in a second. We're going to start from daf Chof Daled Amid Beis on Kesubos. An interesting topic because it's hard to imagine such a situation. But here's the story. And it's daf Chof Daled Amid Beis, about 20 lines from the top, and the Gemara is dealing with how do you know somebody is a Jew? Basically, a guy shows up. And a normal person shows up the guy moves from Ireland, let's say, to your neighborhood, and you don't know if he claims he's Jewish, fine, but maybe he's a mamzer, maybe he's a type of Jew that cannot marry into the Jewish, somebody who's Jewish, Jew from birth, a regular Isha Ksera. So the din is, since at a time when there was no communication, you would need to have two people, witnesses, say that I know his grandfather and grandmother and his grandparents a few generations back to determine he's a kosher person. He's not a mamzer who is hiding out in Ireland and then comes back and now wants to marry a Jewish woman. The Gemara's question is let's say you got a guy from Ireland, okay? He moved to Muncie. Again, no communication. There's in a time when there was no communication. And he convinced people in Muncie that he's a Kohen. And we actually see him go up to Duchen on Yontiv or whatever. He's always Duchening. So the Gemara's question is, Ibailu, let me ask you a question. Mahu la'alois minasias kapayim liyochasen. Once you see somebody that convinced people that he's a Kohen and that he's doing the Duchening, can you assume that he can marry now a Jewish woman? Because by convincing people he's a Kohen, automatically he's saying, now I'm a Jew, not only a Jew, but the greatest Jew, a Kohen Jew, right? So that was the question. So Tiboya, the old Jewish joke about this guy who comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I want to become a Kohen. So the rabbi says to him, I can't make you a Kohen. He says, Rabbi, I'm going to make a big donation to the synagogue. It will end all the problems with the synagogue. All I just want to become is a Kohen. So then when the rabbi hears that, he says, let me think about it. Calls him back. He says, yes, I have a way I can make you a Kohen. Come back to the shul. They make this whole ceremony, and then he gives him a piece of paper after this whole ceremony in front of the Aron. You are now blessed to be a Kohen. He said, thank you, Rabbi. Here's the check. I'm so happy that you made me a Kohen because my grandfather was a Kohen, my father was a Kohen, and now I'm a Kohen also. So it's an old Jewish joke, but it has. But here, a Kohen, once you see him duchening, can you automatically assume that he's not a mamzer and he can marry a Jewish girl? To boil him on the Alma, we're going to ask the same question, according to the opinion that says Malin mitruma liyuchasen. When you see somebody eating truma, let's say you see a Kohen, he's eating truma. You know nothing about this guy. You don't know whose father. He moved from Ireland and he's eating truma. So according to the opinion that says that if you see him eating truma, you could automatically marry a Jewish girl. That's one opinion. And I'll ask the same question according to the opinion that says, no, just because you see him eating truma, you cannot let him marry a Jewish girl. Why? Is duchening any different? Let's see. Let's ask this question according to the Mount de Amma that says that if you see a man eating truma, you could automatically allow him to marry a Jewish girl. So maybe that rabbi said it, that opinion was only said, Hani mili b'truma, only if he's guts enough to eat truma. Because if he's a faker and eating truma, he's dealing with the avoy misihi. He's risking his life because if he's not a Kohen and he's fooling everybody that he is a Kohen, he's basically taking a risk because the Torah says that if you're not a Kohen and you're eating truma, you're subject to the death penalty, misa b'dei shemayim. So that proves that he must be a regular Jewish person, and then certainly he can marry a Jewish girl.
What if he was a guy? He doesn't care about anything like that. He doesn't even know the laws.
Well, the truth is that's a good question. I think the Gemara assumes that he knows enough about the Jewish religion that we're not questioning whether he's a Jew.
Okay.
We're questioning whether he's let's say,
whether he's a Kohen or not. Okay.
Whether he's a mamzer, let's say a mamzer cannot marry, or he's let's say a mitzri or a ger that's not supposed to marry into the Jewish,
No,
into the Jewish
okay.
crowd. So the question is, let's say he's a mamzer. So we see him eating truma. So first of all, davoin misahi, that's a death penalty. Aval nesias kapayim. But if we see him duchening, right? Maybe he is a guy, and the fact that but if he reads the Torah, and the Torah will tell him that even a guy who would probably eat truma probably gets the death penalty. I don't know. Aval nesias kapayim. But if you see him do duchening, there's no risk. The Isser essay, the worst he's going to be over, transgress, is a positive commandment. Loi. Then once we see him doing duchening, that's no proof that he's a Jew or that he's not a mamzer. So therefore, that would not allow him to marry into a Jewish girl. It makes no difference. Whether if you see him, according to that opinion, if you see him convincing people that he could eat truma, and he's been eating truma, you see him convincing people that he's duchening, then you already, accept him into the Jewish, and you allow him to marry a Jewish girl. That would be that opinion. But there is an opinion. Let's ask this a question. According to the opinion, it says ein malim. You cannot allow, just because you see somebody eating truma, doesn't mean he can marry a Jewish girl. Maybe that was only said hani mili truma. Maybe that was only said by truma, the misachla b'tzina, that's eaten privately. So he's not showing people that he's a kohen. Maybe just like you may have tried to say, maybe he's trying to fool people just to eat truma. So that wouldn't prove to me that he can marry a Jewish girl. Aval nesias kapayim de paparhesia. But if he does duchening in shul in front of everybody, so that shows that he's really confident about his Jewishness. He's confident that he's a regular kohen. So then ilav kohenhu. If he wasn't really a kohen, he wouldn't have the guts enough to stand up in shul, do duchening. So it must be a real Jew. So let's allow him to marry a Jewish girl. Or maybe there is no difference. We never, just because you do an act, a holy act of eating truma, a holy act of doing nesias kapayim, doesn't mean that you're automatically allowed to marry a Jewish girl. If I don't know who you are, maybe. So the Gemara says like this: Rav Chizda Ravina. It's a machlokes between Rav Chizda and Ravina. Chadam Amalin. Some say that if you see him doing duchening, even if you have no idea who he is, you can allow him to marry a Jewish girl. The Chadam Ein Malin. One said you cannot allow him to marry a Jewish girl. Amalei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak l'Rava. Rav Nachman Yitzchak said to Rava, "Mahul halis nesias kapayim liyuchsin." He basically asked the same question that we're discussing. If you see somebody doing duchening, can you allow him to marry a Jewish girl if you have no idea who he is? Amalei. So he said to him, Rava said, "Pluk to the Rav Chizda Ravina." That's an argument between Rav Chizda and Ravina, as we discussed. But Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asked Rava, "Hilkasa mahal. What is the halacha?" There are people come from out of nowhere, and they show up in town, and they started duchening. Do we allow him to marry into Jewish girls? What is the halacha? So Rava said, "Amalei ano masnit yadana." I know a brisa. The Tanya. This problem is not an original problem. This is a problem occurred in the time of Tanakh and Ezra, as we've seen this before. That when Ezra came up. Nehemiah came up, and it was Nehemiah came up to build the second base of Mikdash together with Ezra. The only ones that showed up, that came to them, were Jews of questionable lineage. In other words, many of the Jews, after the destruction of the first temple, got to Bavel and they married Goyim. Right? They married Goyim, or they made Giorises or something like that. So. Or they married moms. They weren't careful about who they are, where their lineage is coming from. So the Brisa says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Gedola Chazaka, so powerful is a presumptive status. If someone is presumed a certain status, that overrides any question you have about him. That's such a power of halacha. Shenema, Pasuk says like this: Ubnei HaKahanim, from the sons of Kahanim. They were Kahanim. They claimed to be Kahanim. They joined to come up to the base of Mikdash. Bnei Chavaya, Bnei Akois, Bnei Barzilai, Shlokam, Bnei Barzilai, Hegiladi, Isha, Vayikare Al Shemam. They were families, Chavaya family, Koitz family, Barzilai family, they joined Nehemiah coming up in the second Commonwealth and the start of the second Beis Hamikdash. They claimed to be Kohanim. So Ezra, Nehemiah said to them, okay, show me proof that you're a real Kohen. I'll let you serve now in our new Beis Hamikdash. They tried to search their documents to prove that they are really Kohanim, and they couldn't find it. They couldn't prove it. In other words, they couldn't prove it. So so Ezra disqualified them from the Kohen. In other words, you can't serve in my Beis Hamikdash. So Tishas is the name of Nehemiah. He said to these people, listen, I thank you for coming up, but I'm not letting you serve in my new Beis Hamikdash. You cannot serve in the Beis Hamikdash and eat Kodesh Kadashim from Karbanos until Mashiach comes, basically, he's saying. So Ezra said to them, you are in your presumptive status. I mean, I'm not telling you you're not Koyens anymore. So you're just status quo. Whatever you used to eat in Bavel, which means you used to eat truma, right now you can continue eating truma. So that's what ends the brisa. That's what Ezra told him. Listen, I can't make you serve in my Beis Hamikdash. You're not proving to me that you're kohanim. Therefore, whatever you did till now, for example, let's say you were eating truma, continue to eat truma. If you were duchening in Bavel, continue duchening now that you moved to Israel. That's what Ezra said to them. So now the Gemara asks a question. But if Ezra is really concerned that these people might be mamzerim, they're not really kosher people. The Isal Kadaitach Maler Minisias Kapayim Yochasem. If we have a thought that if you see somebody duchenim, you could automatically allow that person to marry a Jewish girl. Hani, these people, Kivin the Parsi Yadayu, since as soon as they do duchening, right? Also Ilaskinhu, they're going to people are going to assume they can marry Jewish girls. But Ezra himself looked into the lineage and couldn't come to a conclusive research that they are actually kosher Jews. He just said you could continue doing duchening, do truma. And why wasn't Ezra concerned that if we allow them to continue doing duchening, people are going to come to marry? They're going to marry Jewish girls. Maybe they're mamzerim. And says the Gemara, during that period of time, everybody knew that there's something wrong with these kahanim. Why? Because if they were really kahanim, why didn't Ezra allow them to serve in the Beis Hamikdash? So their kahanim status was undermined. So just because people are going to see those people do duchening, nobody's going to come to marry them. And so that was a special time. But maybe Bizman Hazeh, like when we don't have an undermining of the chazaka, maybe we would say if you see somebody doing duchening, you could allow them to marry a Jewish girl. You're not going to say what I said. If you hold that if you eat truma, you could automatically marry a Jewish girl. So Ezra allowed them to continue eating truma. Even the achli b'truma, since these people are going to continue eating truma, asi liskinu, they're going to marry into Jewish girls. And so why didn't Ezra say, stop? I have a problem with your lineage. We can't find any information on you. So why didn't Ezra stop them from eating truma? Elalav. Because it's obvious they're calling themselves kahanim, and Ezra said you can't serve in the Beis Hamikdash. So people are going to question, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't be marrying these people. So that already undermined their whole status. The Ella, so we go to Daf Chofei Amar Aleph. The Ella, my Gedolah Chazaka. What does it mean, Gedolah Chazaka? That means that power of status quo is the same. And says the Gemara, what did Ezra do to these people? I mean, he allowed them to stay kahanim. They were kahanim in Bavel. They moved to Israel. They allowed them to remain kahanim. So what do you see? Where do you see the power of the presumptive status in that situation? And says the Gemara, mi'ikara achul b'truma d'rabbanim. First, they were only allowed to eat truma d'rabbanim. Hashta achul b'truma d'raisa. Now that they moved to Israel, and they can eat. Ezra allowed them to eat truma d'oraisa, which means there are certain truma, certain food items, which the truma is really minat Torah. For example, dagan and sirish, which means wheat and wine. So they actually elevated their status by moving to Israel, albeit when it came to serving in the Beis Hamikdash and partaking in kachi kachim, they were not supposed to, they were not allowed. The Iba is saying, if you want, I can tell you that really, when do you have a presumptive status that if you see somebody eating truma, you automatically allow him to marry a Jewish girl? Only if he eats truma d'oraisa. So, but these people, Ezra never allowed them to eat truma d'oraisa. Hashtanami b'truma d'rabbanan achul, b'truma d'oraisa lo achul. Ezra never gave them. Once he researched the matter and saw these people are a funny character, he only allowed them to continue eating truma d'rabbanan and not a truma d'oraisa. I imagine that Ezra looked at you, calling yourself kahanim. You can't. You have no proof that you're a kohen. So Ezra never allowed them to eat truma d'oraisa just because they moved to Israel. But so then nobody's going to marry them. When are people going to move from somebody eating truma to allow them to marry a Jewish girl? Only betruma d'oraisa. Only if you see him eating truma d'oraisa. Betruma b'rabbanan. But if you see him eating only truma d'rabbanan, loy maskinin, you're not going to allow him to marry a Jewish girl. Ve'lamai gedola chazaka. What was the power of the presumptive status? They didn't move from their presumptive status. They were always eating truma d'rabbanan, and now that they moved to Israel, Ezra still didn't allow them to eat truma d'oraisa. They could only eat truma d'rabbanan. So how did they grow in stature? So the answer is the apagav the ikal migzim mishum truma d'oraisa. Ezra could have even stopped them and say, you can't eat truma d'rabbanan anymore because you might come, now that you move to Israel, you're encountering truma d'oraisa. So you might come to eat truma d'oraisa. So Ezra could have stopped them, like Gazrin, and he didn't make this gezerah. And he says, no, just continue. Make sure that although you're living in Israel, don't eat truma from wheat and wine. You only eat truma from fruits and vegetables and things like that, which are truma d'rabbanan. So the Gemara says, "Uva truma d'oraisa lo achul." Did these people not eat any truma d'oraisa? The pasuk only says, Ezra said to them, don't eat from karbonos, but but maybe truma they could eat. And says the Gemara, no, maybe they could not eat karbonos, but truma d'oraisa they could have eaten. And says the Gemara, no, they didn't eat both. Hachikama, this is what Ezra said to them. Loi b'midi dikra kodesh. Don't eat something that's called kodesh, which means truma. That pasuk means nobody who's not a kohen cannot eat truma. Truma is called kodesh. And Ezra said, don't eat kodesh. And v'loi b'midi dikra kachim, not something that's called karbonos. And that's referring to karbonos. So basically, Ezra was telling them in this pasuk, you can't eat two things. Now that you didn't establish that you're a real kohen, from now on, don't eat truma d'oraisa, which is kodesh, or hakadashim, which is karbonos, and certainly not. I'm not allowing you to serve in the Beis Hamikdash, but you can continue to eat truma d'rabbanan, even though you're now in Israel, you might encounter truma d'oraisa. I'm not going to make a gzeira. That's what Ezra said. So, bottom line over here so far is that the Gemara did not establish the answer to the question. And the question is that if you see a Kohen and you don't know who he is, and he's already made himself like a macher in shul, he moved from Ireland or moved from someplace, nobody knows where he comes from, he shows up, and he convinces people that he's a Kohen and he's duchening. So maybe I would say because he has guts enough to say that he's a Kohen and he's duchening, that he must be really confident that he's a Jew, and therefore, and a kosher Jew, so he can marry a Jewish girl. Do we say you elevate yourself from the siyas kapayim to marrying a Jewish girl? Tashema, come in here. Chazaka lekahuna. If we have a presumptive status when somebody is a kohen, that means we elevate them. What does that mean? Nesiyas kapayim b'bavel. If you see somebody doing induchening in Bavel, you can assume he's a for sure kohen, and now he can do other things. It doesn't say what other things he can do. That's what the Brisa says. V'achilas challah b'Surya. If you see somebody eating challah in Surya, challah is the gift to the kohen from the dough, and in Surya he's eating it in Surya, which we're at that location. Surya is like Israel, so he's eating like truma, and so if you see somebody like that, you can assume he's a kohen. The chilik matonis bekrachen, or he's living in Israel, and people are giving him the parts of the butcher meat that's only gifted to a kohen. So if you see a kohen, if you see a man, you don't know who he is, and he's doing all these things, so you can assume that he's a kohen, and that's it. So what does that mean? You could assume that he's a kohen. If he's doing all these things, he's obviously a kohen. So what are you telling me now? I can assume he's a kohen. It must be we can elevate him that not only is a kohen, but he can also marry a Jewish girl. Ketonimius, there's a partial quote here, Nesias Kapayim, that if we see him duchening in Bavel, right? So we assume he's a kohen, and we can elevate him now and allow him to eat ma'ilav liyochasim, to actually marry a Jewish girl. And says the Gemara, lo, not so. That's not enough of a proof. L'truma, we allow him to eat truma. We assume that if he has guts enough to go to Nesias Kapayim, then we allow him to eat truma. You can give him your truma. We have one of the things is that if you see him eating challah in Surya, so we can assume that he's a kohen. What does it mean? We assume that he's a kohen. Once he eats this, that achilas kalas means we establish him to be a kohen. Now we can allow him to marry a Jewish girl. So that part of the brisa that says we see him duchening, it means we allow him to marry a Jewish girl. So here we're going to have a proof that if you see somebody duchening, you could automatically you can allow him to marry a Jewish girl. So the Gemara says no proof. Lo. Achilas challah gufel truma. What the brisa means to say is that if you see somebody eating challah in Surya, we can allow him now to eat truma. Challah is truma. Isn't it one of the same? Challah is a type of gift to the kohen, no different than truma. So how are you elevating him? So the answer is kisava challah bezman hazeh drabanan. Really, challah, no matter where you go, is only drabanan bezman hazeh. And therefore, if you see him eating challah, he's only doing an issa d'rabbanan, or he's only eating challah b'drabanan. But if he does it enough times, then we can assume that he's a kohen. And now you can give him truma d'oraisa. You can even give him truma d'oraisa. Umaskinan mechallah d'rabanan truma d'oraisa. You could allow somebody go from eating challah d'rabanan to eating truma d'oraisa. But again, that doesn't mean you could elevate him to marry a Jewish girl. You could only allow him go eating challah d'rabanan, go eat truma d'oraisa, but not beyond that. Like Rabbi that is the opinion of Rabbi Huna ben Yeshua versus the Rabbanim that holds challah b'zman hazeh is the Rabbanim and truma is the raisa. We're going to see that in a moment. Tashma, another brisa. Again, we're trying to prove that if you see somebody doing the Nesias Kapayim, duchening, will you allow him to marry a Jewish girl? Chazaka lekahuna. Again, we make somebody, he's a for sure kohen. If you see him Nesias Kapayim v'chilik ronis b'Eretz Yisrael, if you see somebody duchening in Israel, or if you see him eating truma in Israel, B'Eretz Yisrael, assume that he's a kohen. Uvesurya v'chol makom sheshlucha resh chedesh magiyim, in Syria and all these places where the messengers of the Rosh Chodesh would reach, these are special places in Israel that have their own court system. Because I guess once there's a court system in a place, and they have in that place, you have a guy who's doing duchening right in front of the court. So if there was a problem, the court would have stopped him. Apparently they didn't, so he must be a real kohen. Then Nesias Kapayim Raya. Avo lo yichilak ronis, but not by taking truma. That is, in these places, truma is not a proof. Only duchening is a proof. Bavel kesurya. Bavel is like Surya, that duchening is a proof that he's a kohen. Shimon ben Gamliel, af Alexandria shemitzrayim b'rishayna nation bezdin kvuyin sham. If you see somebody duchening in Alexandria of Egypt, and they had a known court system at one time in Egypt, So if you checked out a person says, my grandfather was duchening in Alexandria in Egypt, that's enough of a proof that he's a kohen. Fine. So again, the Bryce is saying that if you see somebody duchening, you can relax a little, you can relax. He's a kohen. What does that mean? He's a kohen. He's duchening already. What do you mean he's a kohen? It means that you can now assume that he's a real kohen, a kosher Jew. He can marry anybody who he wants. Ketani miyas nisiyas kapayim. My lav liyuchzem. You allow him to marry any Jew he wants. Answers the Gemara, loy, lechala. We don't allow him to marry anybody he wants. Lechala. And we allow him to eat challah. So wait a second. We allow him to eat challah, which is like a gift to the kohen. Hoidimia de chulak garanis katano. Ma chilak garanis liyachsen after siyas kapayim liyachsen. Just like if you see him eating truma, we assume he's a kohen, and therefore the brisa means to say that now we can assume he's allowed to get married to a Jewish girl. So therefore, it should be aligned equally. That just like that part refers to allowing him to marry a Jewish girl, after the Siyas Kapayim, when you see him doing duchenin, it also means liyuchasen for lineage, that he can marry a Jewish girl. So why do you, so the Brisa seems to again point to the direction that if you see somebody duchening, it's yuchasen. You could take him and marry into. You allow him to marry. And for the Gemara, like chilek derunais gufa lechala. If you see him eating truma, he can now eat challah. What does that mean? Because this brisa holds kesava truma bezman hazeh drabanan, truma in bezman hazeh is drabanan, and challah is daraisa. So if you see him eating truma, we can elevate him one step up and allow him to eat challah daraisa. To marry a Jewish girl, not, but we can only elevate him a little bit. So you have two brises basically that seem to argue in a specific point. Whether truma nowadays is drabanan or daraisa. What does that mean? We know that when the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash happened, there was the kedusha of Israel went away. When they rebuilt the second temple, the holiness of Israel came back. Did it ever leave with the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash? So if you hold that the holiness still exists in Israel, that means you hold truma bizman hazeh is the da'iraisa. Then you hold truma bizman hazeh is the da'iraisa. I'm going to put it over here. Truma bizman hazeh is da'iraisa, and challah would be drabanan. Challah would be drabanan, and truma would be da'iraisa. But if you learn like this second brisa holds that truma in nowadays is only drabanan. There is no kedusha in Israel like there once was. The second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, but challah, right, the taking off from the dough, that remained in the daraisa. What is the argument about? Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, found Rabbanan. The Amar Rabbanan, Rav Huna b'rei Yeshua. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, says, I found the students of the yeshiva of Rav. Rav Huna found these students, the Yasvi Ka'amre. They were saying over, presumably they're saying over in the name of Rav. Even if you hold Truma nowadays is only in Rabbanan, Chala da'iraisa. The mitzvah of giving off Chala to the Kohen, that is a mitzvah da'iraisa, even with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because Chala always existed in Israel. Because when did Truma start? Truma started after 14 years. When Yeshua entered Israel, it took 14 years, 7 years to capture Israel, and then 7 years to divide it up to the different shvatim. Only then did the mitzvah of Truma start. But the Torah says the mitzvah of Challah starts right away. As soon as Yeshua stepped foot into Israel, even before the war, there was a mitzvah of Challah. So we see that Challah is not determined whether we have the land or we don't have the land. So even Bizman Hazeh, where we don't have Israel or the Beis Hamikdash is not built, Challah will always be daraisa. 7 years that they were capturing and 7 years that they were dividing up Israel, they were obligated to do the mitzvah of Challah and not to do the mitzvah of Truma. So we see that Challah is independent. It's a type of mitzvah that's so independent on the holiness of the land. So said the students of Rav to Rav Huna b'rei Yeshua. And I said, Adarabba, that's not so. I said just the opposite. Even if you hold truma and nowadays is daraisa, chala is always the rabbanon. Why? Why would chala be the rabbanon? Because the Torah says something about chala, about the mitzvah of chala, that all Jews need to live in Israel to have the mitzvah of chala, and that's not true, not applicable to Zman Hazeh. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. The Torah discusses chala and says when you come to Israel, then you should take off from a first part of the dough. What does it mean when you come? Means like two people come into Israel, then Mechayiv and Chala. Talmud Loima b'vayachem b'viyeyas kulchem amartu. I want, when does the mitzvah of Chala apply? It was when all Jews live in Israel. V'loy b'bias mikzaschem, and not when part of you are living in Israel. And v'chi askinhu Ezra, when Ezra came up to build the second Beis Hamikdash, we go to Amid Beis, lav kulei salik. Not everybody went up, and therefore, the challah was d'rabbanan. Back into the Gemara, we're discussing again of Nesias Kapayim. The Gemara says, and then we'll end off with 2 or 3 stories, and that's the end of it. Tashma, we learned in the Brisa, Chazaka l'kuhuna Nesias Kapayim b'chilek ranos ve'edus. Chazaka, that a person is a kohen if he duchens or he's taking truma, and if he has witnesses that he's a kohen, then you know he's a kohen. So that part makes no sense. What do you mean witnesses? The edus chazakahi is edus. If you have witnesses that he's a kohen, is that a presumptive status that he's a kohen? That's a clear proof that he's a kohen. Elalav hachikama. What the Brisa means to say is the siyas kapayim ki edus. If you see somebody duchening, that's almost as if you have 2 people saying about him that he's a kohen. Ma edus, if you have 2 people saying that you're a kohen, liyochsin, that he can marry any Jewish girl, af nesiyas kapayim, so also if you see him duchening, liyochsin, we allow him to marry any Jewish girl. So here we have a clear brisa that says nesiyas kapayim is a proof and allowance to marry a Jewish girl. Answers the Gemara, loy edus haba mikoy chazaka kechazaka. What it means is that we assume he's a kohen. Not that there's edus that are saying that he's a kohen, but let's say we don't know anything about him. We don't know that he duchened, but we know that he went up as he got the first aliyah. That's what we're talking about. He got the first aliyah, so people said testimony that he was a kohen because he got the first aliyah. Let's do this story. The Asi Lakami to Rabami. A man came to Rabami and he said, Amalei muchzakni b'zeshu kohen. I am sure that this individual so-and-so is a kohen. Rabami didn't know anything about that person. Amalei Mari Isa. What did you see about that person that you're saying he's a kohen? Amalei Shekara Rishon b'Beis HaKnesses. He was called up first in a shul. I saw him somewhere, and they gave him the first one. So Rabami asks that just because he got the first aliyah doesn't mean he's a kohen. Becheskes shehu kohen or becheskes shehu gadol. Does that mean he's a kohen? Or maybe he's the great, he's just a Talmud Chacham, and that's why they gave him the first aliyah. How do you know he was a kohen? Answers the Gemara. So he told him Shekara Acharav Levi, that therefore that the person after him was a known Levi, and if he wasn't a kohen, then they wouldn't, and he was just somebody Yisrael that was called up instead of a kohen, then the second aliyah would not have been given to a Levi. The second aliyah would have been given to another Yisrael or something like that. But the fact that they called after this guy a real Levi, it must be that this shul held that this guy is a real kohen. So that was a proof. So it was like a derivative of a proof. The Halei Rav Ami Lekun Al Piv. So Rav Ami established that now that this guy moved to Rav Ami's neighborhood, Rav Ami said, okay, we'll let you be a kohen. Ahud Asei Lekamed Rabbi Shua Levi. A man comes to Rabbi Shua Levi, and he said, Amalei Mechizani B'Seshu Levi. I know so and so that just moved here. He's a Levi. Amalei. So Rabbi Yeshua Levi said, Ma'ara Isa. What did you see about him that you're saying that he's a Levi? He just moved here. I'm not allowing him to be a Levi. And if you allow him to be a Levi, maybe you're going to give him Ma'aser Rishon, Amalei. So the man said, I know he's a Levi. He was called up as number 2 in the shul. So Rab Shua Levi says that doesn't make him a Levi. Becheskeshu Levi, are you sure he's a Levi? Or Becheskeshu Gadol? Maybe they had no kohen, and they called him as number 2 because he was a very chashuv Jew. But that doesn't mean he's a Levi. Answers the guy answered, told Rabbi Shua Levi, Shekara lefonav kohen, because they called in front of him, and the guy that got the aliyah before him was a kohen. The haloi Rabbi Shua ben Levi Levi alpir. And because of that, Rabbi Shua ben Levi said, okay, if that's what you saw, that the guy before him is a kohen, so it must be, if they call him as number 2, he must be a Levi. Because if he wasn't a Levi, they would have given this kohen the second aliyah, as aliyah number 2. Sometimes when there is no Levi, the kohen gets both aliyahs. The fact that they called him as a Levi in that shul must be that they knew for a fact that he's a Levi. So now that he moved to Rabbi Shua ben Levi's town, Rabbi Shua ben Levi took that testimony, and that's a good enough testimony to assume that he's a Levi. So the only way you know he's a Levi is because the guy in front of him was a kohen. That was the way. So that's also enough to establish somebody as a lineage of who he is. One final story. A man comes to Rish Lakish, and he tells him about somebody so-and-so that moved into the neighborhood. I know for a fact that he's a kohen. You see, I guess when these guys moved in and nobody knows who they are, they needed somebody to tell the rabbi I'm certain that this guy is a kohen, or whoever he is. So he told Rish Lakish that I think he's a kohen. Amalei. So Rish Lakish asked him, Mara Isa, what made you think he's a kohen? Because Shekara Rishon b'Beis Knesses. I saw him in another shul somewhere outside, and he was called up as the first one. Amalei, so Rish Lakish said something different. He said, Re'isev Shechilik Alagronis, did you see him eating truma? So that's not enough. Just because they called him in shul, maybe he convinced somebody that he paid money for the aliyah. But did you see him eating truma? Amalei, Rab Lazar, so Rab Lazar, who was sitting when Rish Lakish was talking over here, if you don't have a proof that somebody's eating truma, that means you'll never accept him as a kohen. Why isn't it enough that the other man saw this person being called up as kohen in the shul out of town? Why didn't you accept him, and why didn't you accept that testimony? Zimnan, again, the same story. Hava Yasser Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish was sitting in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Asa Kahal Maisa Lekame. The same story happened. A man walked in and said about so-and-so who just moved into the town that he's a kohen. How do you know? Because I saw him somewhere else that he was called up as kohen. So Rish Lakish said to that guy, Amalei Rish Lakish, V'isev shechilek al hagorim. Did you see him eating truma? I'm not accepting him in the town. Now remember, Rish Lakish is in front of Rabbi Yochanan making this statement. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan said, you can't paskin like that. The main sham garim batla kahuna. If you don't have that proof that he ate truma, does that mean you can never accept him as a kohen? So therefore, it seemed that Rabbi Yochanan was the one who came up with this concept that you don't have to look for him precisely to eating truma. The fact that he got an aliyah in shul, that should be suffice. Now, in the previous story, the same story with Rish Lakish, Rabbi Lazar was the one that said, that if you don't see him eating truma, is that enough to disqualify him? So Rabbi Lazar Bishis. So Rish Lakish saw Rabbi Lazar was embarrassed. He said, "Shamet mili dvana pachav le'matle mishmei." I know, Rabbi Lazar, you got this idea from Rabbi Yochanan of the ancient garim batla kahuna. I wish you would have told me that you heard it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. I would have accepted you in earlier, and I wouldn't have had this confrontation with Rabbi Yochanan. I knew that this idea came from you. Must have gotten this idea from Rabbi Yochanan. She just said that Rabbi Yochanan says in ancient garim batla kahuna. So that's why. But anyway, what you just walk away from this whole brayz is that you can't take people for what they are. I mean, you have to verify. Okay.